Hello and welcome. You're listening to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library and Archives at UN Geneva. It's dedicated to advancing the conversation on multilateralism. And today we're going to be talking about well-beingology with Roberto De Vogli. He is an associate professor at the Department of Developmental Psychology and Socialization at the University of Padua and visiting professor at the University of London. His research focuses on the social determinants of health. So, Roberto, thank you so much for being here today. We met very briefly at the Library and Archives during the Meta-UN Global Outreach Project that was launched by the University of Copenhagen quite recently, that brought together researchers in social sciences, law, and humanities who are all working with and around the UN on global governance. And, perhaps you could just introduce yourself a bit more and also perhaps say why and how you got involved in that conference.
Yes, so good afternoon, and thanks for the interview. Basically, I was involved in the conference because of my expertise in analyzing systemic issues at the societal level that deal with public health, global health, and indirectly to well-being. I've been publishing a book on the danger of civilization collapse in 2013. I also deal with psychology and psychology of power more precisely, but my background is in global health. So I look at the social, economic, and political determinants of health at the population level, not at the individual level. And I try to address different type of topics that make it a bit harder because I have sometimes hard time to define my disciplines, because rather than having just a level of specialization that focuses only on one subject, I have to deal with multiple disciplines in my work. So I need to cross disciplinary boundaries and trying to embrace the science of complexity.
Yes, indeed. It was very interesting, your talk, and exactly that, the interdisciplinarity of it. But I do remember that when you spoke, you started out by telling us all a joke. Now, I can't quite remember what the joke was, but I remember how it surprised everybody, and I thought it was very original. Would you like to start today with a joke?
Yes, so the joke related to this difficulty of finding my discipline when they ask me, what's your discipline? And I ask myself, what's my discipline? I move across so many subjects: social epidemiology, economics, ecology, political sciences, international relations. So the joke was that basically, in order to embrace the science of complexity, you need to go across these disciplinary boundaries. And for example, in the study of well-being, we really need to embrace a transdiscipline that is nothing but no man's land between different social sciences. And I was a bit criticizing specialization in a sense, because it feels that approaching a subject through some specialty lenses is behaving like a hammer in search for nails. So we need analytical precision. We need a strong background that makes studies more analytical and in-depth. At the same time, we need some scientists that look at society from what I can describe as an helicopter view, putting all things together, conducting different type of research exercises that embraces all these different aspects of a single topic. So the joke was that the problem of specialists was to know more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. But of course, there is a problem also for the generalists of the scientists of complexity. The problem for us is to know more and more about more and more until you know nothing about everything.
Exactly. So do tell us a bit more, because I remember how many disciplines you showed on one of your slides as being involved in what you term well-beingology. I doubt very much that it's a term that most people have heard of. How do you define well-beingology? And also, why do we need this transdisciplinary approach? You've touched a bit on that. Perhaps you could expand a little.
Yes, I came up with the idea of well-beingology while preparing the slides a few hours before. I was still finishing the slides because it dawned on me that we don't have science of the study of well-being and its determinants. And that's exactly what well-beingology might be defined. The study of well-being and its determinants, and also the policies and the organized efforts of society to protect and promote well-being. So well-beingology can be conceptualized as a no man's land. I said also no woman's land. Among all the social sciences that study well-being, psychology, medicine, biology, sociology, philosophy, economics, political sciences, international relations, law, history, ecology, anthropology. Although it touches on all these disciplines, the study of well-being cannot be reduced to any of these disciplines. That's why I define well-beingology as a transdiscipline, because it goes across all these disciplines. It touches on all of them, but cannot be reduced to any of them.
Exactly. So tell us a bit more about science and what the science tells us about what really makes us happy.
Yes, so well-being is a subject that occupied the minds of so many scientists, philosophers, psychologists. And I have to say that although there are lots of definitions, there is no universal agreement on a definition that can make everyone happy. Well-being has been studied since the times of Plato, Aristotle, even earlier. One definition, for example, says that well-being is a combination of feeling good, functioning well, experiencing positive emotions such as happiness and contentment, as well as the development of one's potential, having some control over one's life, having a sense of purpose, and experiencing positive relationships. So, although there are challenging issues with the definition of the topic, we also have lots of evidence, studies, and research that have thrown light on this subject. One of the issues is that well-being sometimes is exchanged for a constellation of other factors that could be overlapping with well-being. I mean, happiness, life satisfaction, positive mental health, quality of life. So although these concepts are related, they are different from well-being. For example, life satisfaction is defined as the degree to which a person positively evaluates the overall quality of his life. By contrast, happiness is an emotional state that involves feelings of joy, especially at the cognitive emotional level. And the literature has also studied well-being using two categories. One is the hedonic approach, and the second one is called eudaimonic approach. Basically, the hedonic perspective defines well-being in terms of pleasure, positive emotions, subjective feelings of happiness. The eudaimonic perspective emphasizes self-actualization, meaning in life, even virtue, authenticity, and the fulfillment of human potential. Although these two views are different, they tend to be complementary in making us understand well-being. It's not just positive feelings. It's not just sense of coherence and fulfillment. It's both of them. And also in the study of well-being, we recognize that there are subjective indicators of well-being that can be perceived by the individual, but also objective indicators of well-being that relate, for example, to access of material resources or the conditions of living under which people found themselves. So the study of well-being is a process of reduction of uncertainty rather than discovering a definite type of indicator of well-being. But this reduction of uncertainty can be accomplished by putting together the constellation of indicators that can help us understand well-being both at the individual level, but also at the collective level, because we can study well-being at the individual of a person, but also we can study the well-being of entire societies. Sometimes well-being has been exchanged or conceptualized as human flourishing. This is the concept used not used by Aristotle, but that can be translated or in a sense to the approach that Aristotle used. And this is also echoing the approach of Abraham Maslow hierarchy of needs, where basic material needs are at the basis of the pyramid of needs. And while higher levels of needs like self-esteem, purpose, and self-actualization are placed at the top. So, yeah, that's well-being in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, I think you've done very well to do the whole tour of a very multidimensional construct. But your area in particular is on determinants of health and well-being. And we see that most health outcomes are determined by factors other than healthcare. What do you say are the major factors that matter for our health?
Yes, thanks for introducing the concept of health, because health is so important for well-being, and well-being is so important for health as well. So there is a reciprocal causation and influence between the two. But since we have really an overwhelming amount of evidence from epidemiology, that is the study of health and distribution of diseases and mortality in a population, the study of well-being can benefit from that type of research and from that type of conceptual framework to understand health. So I prefer in my investigation of well-being to look at well-being and health at the same time. Many of the factors that influence health also influence well-being. So in order to understand well-being, we need to understand the determinants. And there are multiple factors. They relate not just to individual choices or individual predispositions, even personality or genetic risk factors or genetic biological factors, but also determinants of well-being can be found in the social, economic, and political environments and institutions that affect well-being at multiple levels. So at the macro, meso, and even micro level. So when studying well-being, we need to put together all these complex list of factors that are influencing well-being, but also they are interacting with one another. And socioeconomic conditions are so important. That's why I had no choice but investigate economics. Rather than economics, the political economy of well-being and happiness. That is nothing but the study of the distribution of power and the distribution of wealth and income in a society, because the distribution of power and the distribution of wealth and income is so important for the well-being of populations, because socioeconomic conditions are the most important determinants of health across a long list of causes of death and across a long list of illnesses. So to study well-being, you need to study all these socioeconomic and political factors and the social environment where people live, even the social relationship, the social cohesion of a society, and the policies at the community level, at the national level, and even at the global level, looking at international financial institutions or free trade agreements, for example, are some of the determinants of well-being. And so this is a very complex science that needs to put together all this array of factors, and the socioeconomic forces are perhaps the most important determinants of both. We know for sure for health, but also well-being is strongly influenced by socioeconomic conditions.
Yes. And I also remember you pointing out, and I found it quite striking the way you said it, how these structural and social factors become really inscribed in our biology, and that we embody these inequalities, which obviously has very negative effects on our health and well-being. Would you like to just tell us a bit more about this process of embodiment?
Yes, it's intriguing that you use the term embodiment in reference to negative outcomes because most literature emphasize on this. But I think that the embodiment concept should be explored on the positive side as well. How the social environment is fostering your well-being, your sort of happiness and health. So let's go back to the concept to clarify what it is. Embodiment refers to how we biologically internalize the material, social, economic circumstances in which we live from conceptions to death. So it's like a life course. So going back to how the concept of embodiment that's been studied, embodiment has helped to explain how structural inequalities and structural factors like poverty, racism, even environmental degradation becomes biologically embedded. And our bodies carry the imprints of these social conditions over time, contributing to our health and even happiness. So scientific research has studied stress in particular, because stress sometimes, although it has been conceptualized as an acute type of event that people may have to face or endure, chronic stress has become a promising factor and can be even measured through, for example, biological indicators like the cortisol level or inflammatory markers are indirect measures of chronic stress. So the chronic stress is this wear and tear that the social conditions create on our body and can basically predispose us to diseases, predispose us to longer life expectancy or shorter life expectancy, and even the difference between our chronological age and biological age. So we can see that people who live well have some favorable socioeconomic circumstances and social circumstances, even behavioral, tend to age in a different way than people who are exposed to this accumulation of social factors that are going to be inscribed in their body. So that's why socioeconomic conditions embodiment has become so important for us. I remember years ago, psychologists thought that people in busy jobs, like, I don't know, executives making lots of telephone calls, were the most distressed people in society. No, social epidemiology told us another story. The most psychologically and distressed people, those who are exposed to the most threatening aspects of chronic stress, are people in lower socioeconomic conditions, people living, working on humble jobs, people having financial problems, people living in low quality houses, people living in neighborhoods that are not so well served and lucky like the richest neighbor. I just want to add that although socioeconomic conditions are so important for health and well-being, I didn't want to mean that money can buy happiness. In reality, the relationship between socioeconomic indicators and health and life satisfaction or well-being is very strong, especially if you are poor. After a certain threshold, more money don't make people happier or healthier because there is a sort of diminishing returns of money on this. And in fact, well-being, after we guaranteed some basic needs and material security of life, is entirely dependent on social relationships, on our capability to fulfill our aspirations in life, the factors of the higher needs of Maslow that can also relate, for example, what people list as the major regrets of life. I mean, virtually no one, when interviewed before dying, said, I wish I devoted more effort to raise more money, to become more powerful, more famous, and having a better job. Everybody regrets not having spent more time with their significant others, not having fulfilled some of their passions, not having spent time pursuing their dreams, and not having developed certain type of affinities that they wanted to develop.
So we've looked at some of the social determinants of health, but also the environment that we live in affects us so much. And I remember in the talk that you gave that you made a really very strong point about climate change, saying that climate change is not an ecological crisis. Would you like to tell us a bit more about what you think the crisis really is?
Yes, when analyzing well-being, it's important not only to understand well-being now, but well-being in the future. And the future well-being is threatened by the environmental crisis. That the Lancet, but one of the most prestigious academic journals in the world, says that climate change is the greatest global health threat facing the world in the 21st century. So being a threat to health is also a threat to well-being. So when analyzing well-being, some scientists developed the idea of sustainable well-being. Why? Because we need to understand well-being not only now, but in the future, given the ecological trends we are facing today. And climate change is not even a health or a well-being problem, and is even more than an ecological crisis because it is an existential threat now. Although scientists usually are very cautious, now we read scientific papers in the proceedings of national academies of science saying that there is ample evidence that climate change could become catastrophic. Two authors have estimated that climate change could create existential threat, and we have a 1 in 20 chance of a catastrophic outcome. The authors have said it's like to have 1 in 20 chance the plane you're about to board will crash. We will never, ever get on that plane with a 1 in 20 chance of crashing. But the two authors added, so why are we willing to send our children and grandchildren on that plane? Making the case that we need to take care now of the well-being of the future because of this climate crisis we are facing today.
Yes, exactly. And what you said earlier too about money is so important and brings out also the importance of understanding a bit more about these models of well-being so that we know what really does matter for our lives. You wrote a book, Progress or Collapse, the Crises of Market Greed, and it explains how all of this goes hand in hand with associated, psychological and the social, cultural, political, economic crises. Tell us a bit more how you see the connection between all of these different crises, including climate.
Yes, although the ecological crisis has been the subject of ecologists and environmentalists, and this gets back to the idea of specialty and specialization, right? Which is very important. We are very grateful to ecologists, environmentalists, and people who study the details of the ecological crisis, like the scientists I just quoted, or other scientists that have investigated the so-called tipping points of the ecosystem or the planetary boundaries. Although we should be very grateful for this type of approaches, I think what we miss is to understand that the ecological crisis is just a symptom of a cascade of factors that comes from the metabolism of the entire socioeconomic system. So in order to understand the causes of the ecological crisis, we need to understand the economy, for example. One example is, why do we have nations now, most nations, that prioritize economic growth and the so-called market forces over any other type of human goals, making a sort of confusion between what should be the ultimate goal of a nation? That should be health and well-being. Now we have the economy that is prioritized over health and well-being, and health and well-being are reduced into means of economic ends. This should go the other way around. The economy should just be support for health and well-being, just making an example. Also, the political system has to change, because basically political parties have a short-term approach for next elections in order to really adopt climate change policies that are effective. We need a long-term approach. We need planning. We need a sort of coalition of scientists, politicians, economists, and intellectuals working on a transition where we make sure that we try not to cross all these planetary boundaries. But I would even say that the ecological crisis is also a philosophical crisis about the meaning of our life, or what makes us happy and well. So if we aspire for material wealth, if we aspire for perpetual increase of GDP per capita and our economic status, we may create some effects on the ecosystem, when evidence also shows that we can be happy a much lower level of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's what I meant for climate change is not an ecological crisis. Of course, it's a provocative approach. We need to really understand the crisis looking at all these risk factors. Otherwise, we keep studying the symptom, but not the diseases that is basically producing this symptom.
True. It really does sound like we need to refocus on meaning and purpose of our lives. You've mentioned some of the planetary boundaries, and we know that we have crossed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. To what extent do you think we're taking this seriously, this and all the other crises that you've explained so well, the interlinkages of?
Yes, so you mentioned the planetary boundaries, of course, and you said that we basically have crossed already 6 out of 9. So planetary boundaries are ecological thresholds that define a safe operating space for humanity, and crossing them increases the risk of irreversible ecological change, type of change that is not linear, but is basically governed by a threshold effect. And after certain threshold, even interventions to stop process will not work, because after that threshold, the change is irreversible, basically. So scientists and ecologists, environmentalists, activists have warned us for years, for half a century, even more than half a century. I remember the limits of growth report, 1974, but even earlier. Carl Polanyi, for example, in his work, The Grain Transformation, he really looked at how capitalism creates idiosyncratic effects on the environment. And it was like even more than half a century ago, for sure. So what are we doing now in spite of this potentially catastrophic outcomes? I think there have been some changes. There have been some significant interventions, and there has been a growing attention on sustainability and climate change. Yet these changes and these interventions are still too superficial. They are not made understanding that this is an existential threat. We are still treating climate change as an ecological crisis. Even we say save the planet. The planet will be fine without us. It is us that we need to save ourselves, right? So in my last book, I I put it a bit provocatively, that without radical changes in the economy, lifestyle, and the political system, current climate change policies are greenwashing, green wishing, and green wishy washing. I mean, we need really bold approaches where we try to collaborate, we try to coordinate transnational action, facing a real enemy that is not another flag, another country, another people, another population. Is this ecological calamity, ecological crisis that basically put us all in the same boat, because there is no planet B, as our slogan said, right? So my hope is that this global nature of the ecological crisis will finally make us more and more people understanding that rather than proceeding, promoting human progress through competition, we should embolden cooperation. And we know from studies, evolutionary biology studies, studies dealing with human nature, that we have not just competitive instincts as human beings, but also strong cooperative instincts. So I hope that this cooperative instinct will trigger new policies and new understanding of the other, because we seem to be still thinking in terms of nations, which is fine. I'm not saying that people should drop flags, national anthems, and the diversity that they want to protect. At the same time, we should embrace some sort of cosmopolitanism and egalitarianism that go across borders, because these are global threats. We cannot basically fight climate change through national policies. We need global transnational policies.
Yes, it needs to be a world-embracing vision. What does sustainable well-being look like then? Can you explain to us a bit more about your concept of a well-being economy?
Yes. After introducing the concept of well-beingology, we need to introduce another concept that is well-being land or well-being nation, right? So complaining about the ecological crisis or the structural inequalities of society is just one part of the discussion. The second one should be, how do we build a better world, and how do we create some of the solutions that can resolve the problems we are facing? There are different approaches and lots of creative ideas from different scientists. One of the basically authors I quote repeatedly is Andrew Sims, that in Canceling the Apocalypse, he came up with the idea of well-being land. He says that well-being land is basically a nation that has adopted policies that made society much more sustainable and much more egalitarian. It is a society, for example, where fossil fuels are being phased out, health and education and services are free, child and elderly care is subsidized by the state. In good land, the constitution has been written by the citizens. There are laws that establish the protection of the ecosystem. The president donates a large part of his salary to the poor. There is a dynamic local banking system helping small businesses. And the working week is much shorter than in other countries. In well-being land, economic growth is not the primary goal, but just a means to well-being and human rights and health. And of course, Andrew Sims says, it sounds like utopia, right? All these policies to happen right now. But he says good land is not a fantasy, because good land has already existed. Basically, all these virtuous examples I just mentioned happened in some different countries or are happening at the moment. But the challenge, of course, is to put all this together and create a sort of social system where nations are able to think themselves as a one single society, not just nations. And this also reminds me of a concept in psychology that has been developed by a psychologist that dealt with both psychology and human rights, he came up with the idea of identification with whole humanity. The idea that we are not just citizens of a nation, but we are also part of a broader family that is humanity. And that's when feelings of empathy, reciprocity, and cooperation can be emboldened, when we think that others are us and we are others, basically.
I think we need these books on our bookshelves. So, Roberto, as we're coming to a close now, you've painted quite a positive challenge for us to live up to there. But is there more you'd like to say to leave us on a positive note after this conversation?
Yeah, so, human beings have been characterized, the history of Homo sapiens have been characterized by some of the worst horrible atrocities we can think of: genocide, wars, and exploitation, occupation, colonization, and still wars, unfortunately, is something that we have to deal with. But human nature has also shown to be very, very capable of altruism, mutual aid, and reciprocity. And although there is no consensus even here on what human nature really is, because some evolutionary biologists say we are, for example, I don't know if you remember this seminal book by Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Genes. We are selfish machines, and we tend to progress and compete because we are governed by these genes. Others say that humans have not progressed thanks to competition, the survival of the fittest, but they have survived because of cooperation, because they managed to make sure that cooperative efforts, mutual aid, help us to basically face predators and environmental conditions. So the positive note to me is that we should not assume that human nature is fixed and we cannot change things. We should assume exactly the opposite, because all social transformations occur through small groups of citizens that have been determined to change things, like the anti-slavery movement or the civic rights movement, or so many examples. So I would say also that we should not assume that human nature is competitive or warlike, violent. We are destined to wars because we show to be different. And there is plenty of evidence showing it's the environment, is the context is going to determine very strongly who we are going to be, how competitive, selfish, violent, or how kind, altruistic, and egalitarian.
I think that gives us a lot of hope. Thank you for this. Thank you, Dr. De Vogli, for joining us today. And we look forward to this social transformation.